Hey guys, Nick from ArchCityPLO.com and Arch City Poker. Today's video, this week's video rather, I'm going to start part one of a two-part series. Going to talk about how to play our draws. I have videos on this from a while back, I think maybe a couple years ago, but these topics are fun and nice to revisit, to reiterate if there's anything that has changed. If not, then it's good, like I said, to reiterate certain concepts and thoughts. So part one, we're going to talk about when and why we generally would play our draws aggressively. Next week, we're going to talk about when we would slow down with them, but kind of some general thoughts and things that I see from players or that I see in forums that I hear from players that I've played with live or online. I think there's a big misconception that you're either supposed to play all of your draws or certain draws very aggressively. You're never supposed to check certain draws or you're always supposed to check certain draws. It does depend. And I will say that in general, most low stakes players are not going to play their draws aggressively enough in most spots. If you play them aggressively, you have two ways to win. Think about it logically. If you hit, then you win, of course, right? If you make your hand, you usually have the best hand. And anybody can do that over the long term. The math is going to work out about the same for everybody as far as how often they hit a flush draw or hit an open ender by the time they get to the river. But if you play them aggressively with fold equity, if you get a player to fold, then you're going to win more often. It gives you two ways to win. Now, a lot of you understand that, but you still might not apply it on the table enough of the time or correctly. I do think that there are times where you do need to slow down with your draws, but we're going to save that for next week. So some general thoughts on when and or why we would play our draws aggressively. If you believe you have a strong range advantage, if your opponent perhaps is cold calling pre-flop with too wide of a range, if they are limp calling a lot, if it's simply a board texture that you know you have a lot more of like the nuttier, better combos on, range and polarity advantage. We've talked about that a lot. I cover that in my step-by-step videos on my site. Then you have the means and you have the right to go ahead and play your draws more aggressively. You're going to want to play them aggressively when you have fold equity. If especially you have an opponent that doesn't maybe think on that level, it's just really a matter of, do you believe their range does not connect with the flop texture often enough? Then you can a lot of times just become very aggressive with most all of your draws. Take advantage of that fold equity. Go ahead and play them more aggressively. Now, where you would have to slow down is if you had a more aggro opponent that could blow you off of your equity, or if you had a calling station. I'm going to save that for next week. But in general, if you have the range advantage, if you just have more better hands that connect with the flop texture compared to your opponent, and it's like an and/or situation. Or maybe more importantly, at this level, if your opponent does not hit the flop texture hard enough, often enough, you should play your draws more aggressively. Now, the second part of all of this is, what about different types of draws? Like, not all draws are to be treated equally, right? So if you have a nut draw of some sort, they generally should be played aggressively. The more showdown value you have, perhaps, the more often that you can slow down with them. But I would say in general, if you do have a nut flush draw, nut open ender, those probably do want to be played a little more aggressively. If you have kind of middling equity, like a weaker flush draw, a non-nut open ender, sometimes some of your better gutters where you have like two overcards and then the nut gutter, those hands can be played a little bit slower, and I'm going to save those for next week. But when you get into the bottom third of your range, when you have gutters, maybe some really weak flush draws that you don't love to maybe check call with, or you don't want to play a big pot with, but maybe you do have some fold equity with those, they don't have as much showdown value, then those are the hands you want to play a little more aggressively as part of your bluffing range, especially those gutters, guys. I see one of the biggest mistakes I see low stakes players make, and this is, I'm talking about mainly No Limit, but the general thoughts can apply to No Limit and PLO. But with gutters and No Limit, I see players play them way too passively. Yes, there are times where you have to do some calling with your gutters, just because you'll mathematically get run over if you don't. But in general, those hands do not hit often enough to justify just calling down with them. You're going to want to play them more aggressively, especially if we go back to the first 2 points. If you have a range advantage, and maybe more importantly, if your opponent does not connect with the flap texture that hard in your mind. If that's the case and you feel very confident in that, as far as that decision goes and that analysis goes, then I would go ahead and play your gutters a lot more aggressively in those spots. So I hope that this video was valuable to you guys. I will be back next week, as I said, with part 2, when to play your draws a little more passively, when to slow down with them, perhaps realize equity with those, balance your ranges a little bit against tougher players. We'll get into that next week. If you guys have any questions or comments, let me know in the comment section, of course. Click on the link to archcityplo.com. I'm still adding tons of content weekly there. I also just dropped my annual paid plan prices. So there's a big discount for you guys that are willing to commit for the year. I wanted to reward players that are willing to make that kind of commitment. So they're going to get a pretty large discount on those plans. Otherwise, I will catch you guys next week. Thanks.